Hello there, weary traveler, and welcome to this cozy corner of history. Before we journey back through time together, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you right now. There's something magical about sharing these medieval moments across time zones. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. If you enjoy this style of calm, immersive tales from the past, go ahead and click that subscribe button so you don't miss future episodes, where we explore history's most fascinating mysteries. Now let's allow the stresses of the modern world to melt away as we travel back to a time long ago to witness one of medieval history's most terrifying moments, when darkness fell at midday and an entire civilization thought the world was ending. Imagine yourself in a medieval village, dawn breaking slowly over thatched roofs and cobblestone streets. The year is 1133, and you're standing in the courtyard of a monastery somewhere in England. The morning air is crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke from countless hearths and the earthy smell of dew-dampened stone. Monks are beginning their morning prayers, their voices echoing softly through corridors that have witnessed centuries of faith and devotion. Picture the scene more vividly now. Candles flicker in narrow windows, casting dancing shadows on walls built thick enough to withstand both time and siege. The bells of the monastery tower call out across the countryside, summoning not just the faithful, but marking the rhythm of life itself, in an age where timepieces are rare and precious. Birds chirp hesitantly in the growing light, and somewhere in the distance a rooster crows, announcing another day in a world that moves to nature's ancient rhythm. But this particular morning carries something different in the air. There's an unease among the villagers who have gathered outside the monastery gates, something that goes beyond their usual concerns about harvest yields or the constant threat of raiders. The blacksmith has paused his bellows, leaving his forge cold, despite the day's work waiting. The baker's wife clutches her shawl tighter around her shoulders, not from cold, but from a fear she cannot quite name. Even the children seem subdued, staying closer to their mother's skirts than usual. You see, in this medieval world, the sky above is not merely a dome of blue or grey, but a vast tapestry woven by divine hands, where every cloud, every star, every shift in celestial patterns carries meaning far beyond what we might consider today. The heavens are God's own cathedral, and when something unusual appears there, it is not merely an astronomical event, but a message, a warning, or perhaps even a judgment from the Almighty himself. The village priest, Brother Thomas, emerges from the stone chapel, his brown robes rustling softly as he walks. His face, weathered by years of outdoor sermons and countless vigils, bears an expression of deep concern. In his hands he carries an ancient manuscript, its pages yellowed with age and filled with calculations that would seem almost mystical to the common folk. He has been studying the movements of celestial bodies, not out of scientific curiosity, as we might understand it today, but because the Church itself recognizes that God speaks through the heavens. As Brother Thomas approaches the gathered villagers, you can hear the soft whisper of parchment as he turns the fragile pages. His finger traces lines of Latin text, words that speak of lunar cycles and solar patterns, of predictions made by learned men in distant monasteries who spend their lives watching the sky. The manuscript tells of something approaching, something that has not been seen in living memory, something that will transform day into night in a matter of moments. The villagers press closer, their faces a mixture of reverence and fear. They know that Brother Thomas possesses knowledge beyond their understanding, that he can read not only the Holy Scriptures, but also the mysterious movements of the sun and moon. When he speaks of celestial events, they listen with the same attention. They give to his Sunday sermons, because in their world there is no separation between the sacred and the astronomical. "My children," Brother Thomas begins, his voice carrying the weight of both authority and compassion, "the calculations of our learned brothers speak of a time approaching when the moon will pass before the face of the sun." His words hang in the morning air like incense, heavy with significance that each listener interprets through the lens of their own fears and beliefs. For these medieval minds, such an event cannot be merely a coincidence of orbital mechanics, a concept that would not emerge for centuries to come. Instead, it must be a sign of divine displeasure, a harbinger of plague or famine, war or death. The sun, which they see as God's own eye watching over creation, will be covered by the shadow of the moon. What could such a thing mean, except that God himself has chosen to look away from the world, leaving humanity in darkness? You can feel the collective intake of breath from the gathered crowd. See the way mothers instinctively draw their children closer, watch as grown men cross themselves and whisper prayers under their breath. In their minds, the approaching eclipse is not a natural phenomenon to be observed and studied, but a supernatural event that could herald the end of the world itself. It settles into bones and hearts, creating a tension that will build over the coming days and weeks as word spreads from village to village, carried by traveling merchants and wandering pilgrims who whisper of the coming darkness with voices full of dread. Brother Thomas continues reading from his manuscript, describing how the darkness will fall in the middle of the day, how the temperature will drop, how even the birds will return to their roosts in confusion. To modern ears, these might sound like interesting observations about eclipse behavior, but to medieval listeners, they sound like descriptions of the apocalypse itself. The village blacksmith, a man whose hands are permanently stained with soot and whose arms bear the scars of countless sparks, steps forward with a question that echoes in the hearts of all present. Father, what must we do to prepare for such a thing? How can we protect our families when God himself turns his face from us? It's a question that speaks to the very heart of medieval existence, where survival depends not just on physical preparation, but on spiritual readiness. These people live in a world where divine favor and earthly prosperity are intimately connected, where a good harvest is seen as a blessing and a poor one as punishment for collective sin. Brother Thomas closes the manuscript gently, handling it with the reverence due to sacred knowledge. We must pray, he says simply, and we must trust in God's mercy, even when we cannot understand his purposes. The darkness will come, but it will also pass, as all trials must pass for those who keep faith. But even as he speaks these comforting words, you can see the uncertainty in his own eyes. For Brother Thomas, learned as he is, also lives in a world where the line between natural and supernatural is drawn very differently than it would be in centuries to come. He may understand the mechanics of celestial movement better than his parishioners, but he too wonders what divine message might be encoded in the approaching eclipse. As the sun rises higher, casting longer shadows across the cobblestones and illuminating the faces of the worried villagers, something extraordinary approaches. The celestial dance that has been unfolding for millennia is drawing closer to its dramatic climax, and neither the learned Brother Thomas nor the humblest peasant can truly comprehend what they are about to witness. The eclipse is coming, and, with it, a terror that will grip not just this small English village, but communities across the known world, as humanity prepares to face what they believe might be the end of everything they hold dear. Now let's explore medieval understanding of eclipses, and I promise you, the gap between scholarly theory and everyday terror was absolutely mind-blowing. Picture Brother Marcus in his monastery scriptorium, hunched over calculations by flickering candlelight. His ink-stained fingers trace astronomical tables that predict eclipses with startling accuracy. He understands orbital mechanics, lunar nodes, the mathematical precision of celestial dance. Yet step beyond his stone walls, and you'd find his own sister, a baker in the village below, who believes eclipses happen when cosmic dragons devour the sun. This wasn't ignorance versus enlightenment. This was knowledge trapped in an ivory tower, while terror roamed free in the streets. I'm fascinated by how medieval scholars actually understood eclipses far better than most people realize. In the great monasteries of Europe, men like Bede the Venerable had already grasped the basic mechanics by the 8th century. These weren't ignorant Dark Age mystics. They were brilliant minds working with the tools they had. Bede could calculate when eclipses would occur, understanding that the moon passed through Earth's shadow, or that the moon blocked the sun's light. The mathematical precision was actually incredible. But here's where it gets really interesting. And this is the kicker that most people miss entirely. The knowledge stayed locked away in those monastery libraries. Imagine Brother Benedict, hunched over his calculations in the scriptorium of some remote abbey, perfectly predicting that darkness would swallow the sun on a specific Tuesday in March. He understands the celestial mechanics, he's traced the orbits, he's done the math, but that knowledge, it never leaves those stone walls. Imagine two worlds existing side by side, separated by stone walls and social class. In the monastery of Chartres, Master Geoffrey holds in his hands a treatise that maps eclipse cycles across centuries. He can tell you that the next solar eclipse will occur on March 15th, 1140, visible for exactly 3 minutes and 27 seconds. His calculations are flawless, his understanding profound. Meanwhile, 3 miles down the muddy road, Geoffrey's own cousin William, a skilled carpenter who can build cathedrals that touch heaven, stands paralyzed with terror when that same predicted eclipse arrives. To William, those 3 minutes and 27 seconds aren't mathematical precision. They're the end of the world. This creates the most heartbreaking irony in medieval history. Knowledge existed, brilliant, accurate, scientific knowledge, but it lived in a prison of Latin manuscripts and academic isolation. This creates the most heartbreaking irony in medieval history. Knowledge existed, brilliant, accurate, scientific knowledge, but it lived in a prison of Latin manuscripts and academic isolation. Picture this scene. Brother Thomas, who can calculate eclipses to the minute, sits sharing evening ale with his village neighbors. Young Agnes mentions her terror of the blood moon she saw last week. Thomas knows exactly what caused that lunar eclipse. He could draw diagrams, cite Ptolemy, explain atmospheric refraction, but he stays silent. How do you translate orbital mechanics into the language of a seamstress? How do you bridge the chasm between academic theory and everyday terror? The knowledge was there, the communication was not. And the scholars themselves weren't immune to the psychological terror. This is the part that absolutely blows my mind. Even the men who understood the mechanics intellectually could still feel that primal fear when darkness fell at midday. Imagine, Master William of Conches, one of the greatest scientific minds of the 12th century, standing in his monastery courtyard as the sun begins to disappear. His rational mind knows exactly what's happening. He's calculated this eclipse himself. But as the temperature drops and the birds fall silent, and that eerie twilight begins to creep across the landscape, even his scholarly courage wavers. The medieval worldview made this even more complex. These weren't secular scientists working in a godless universe. They were deeply religious men trying to understand God's creation. So when they looked at an eclipse, they saw both natural phenomenon and divine message. It was simultaneously a predictable celestial event and a sign from heaven. This dual interpretation created this incredible tension in medieval eclipse understanding that I find absolutely fascinating. Take someone like Robert Grosseteste, Bishop of Lincoln in the 13th century. This man was a brilliant natural philosopher who understood optics and astronomy at a level that wouldn't be surpassed for centuries. He could explain how light behaves, how celestial bodies move, why eclipses occur. But he also believed that God used natural phenomena to communicate with humanity. So an eclipse was both a shadow cast by astronomical mechanics and a divine warning. Both explanations were simultaneously true in his worldview. The really crazy part is how this knowledge was preserved and transmitted. Picture the scene. A young novice monk, maybe 16 years old, copying manuscripts in some remote abbey. He's transcribing Ptolemy's Almagest, carefully reproducing diagrams that show exactly how lunar and solar eclipses work. His hand cramps from hours of precise copying, ink staining his fingers as he reproduces mathematical formulas that predict eclipses decades in advance. He understands every word he's writing. He has to, in order to copy it accurately. Yet when he looks up at the sky during an actual eclipse, that intellectual knowledge battles against centuries of inherited fear and superstition. The manuscripts themselves tell this incredible story. I've studied illuminated texts where the same page contains both precise astronomical calculations and images of dragons devouring the sun. The scientific and the mythological cite side by side not as contradictions, but as different ways of understanding the same terrifying reality. These medieval scholars weren't choosing between reason and superstition. They were trying to integrate both into a coherent worldview, and the monasteries became these incredible repositories of eclipse knowledge. Canterbury Cathedral, Cluny, Abbey, the great houses of learning scattered across Europe. They all maintained astronomical records that tracked eclipses with remarkable precision. Some of these records are so detailed that modern astronomers use them to study slight changes in Earth's rotation over centuries. The dedication was absolutely incredible. But here's what gets me every time. All this knowledge, all this scholarly, understanding all these brilliant minds working to comprehend the heavens, and it made virtually no difference to the average person's experience of an eclipse. When that shadow began to creep across the sun, when the light started to fade and the temperature dropped and the animals began to panic, scholarly understanding meant nothing compared to the raw terror of watching the world seemingly end before your eyes. This tension between knowledge and fear, between understanding and terror, between the scholarly and the popular, that's what made medieval eclipse experiences so uniquely intense. The knowledge existed to explain what was happening, but it remained locked away in monasteries and universities, accessible only to a tiny, educated elite. Everyone else faced the darkness armed only with legends, prayers, and the desperate hope that somehow, someway the sun would return and the world would continue to exist. But theory meant little when darkness actually fell, and ordinary people found themselves staring up at a sun, being devoured by invisible forces, their entire world plunging into an impossible twilight that challenged everything they thought they knew about the natural order of creation. From scholarly understanding to raw human experience, here's where this story takes a turn that will completely redefine everything you thought you knew about medieval courage. The morning of August 12th, 1133, dawned with an eerie stillness that even the most superstitious among us would have noticed. I want you to picture this scene with me, because what unfolded that day would shake the very foundations of medieval understanding. In the village of Cluny, the air hung thick and humid, unusual for an August morning in Burgundy. The roosters, normally reliable heralds of dawn, seemed hesitant in their crowing, as if nature itself sensed something amiss. The bells of the Great Abbey began their morning call to lords, but even their bronze voices seemed muted, swallowed by an atmosphere that felt pregnant with anticipation. Brother Benedict, the Abbey's chronicler, whose meticulous records would later prove invaluable to historians, noted in his journal that morning, "The very air seems to hold its breath." He wasn't alone in this observation. From the humblest peasant to the most learned scholar, people across medieval Europe would later describe this same sensation, this collective unease that preceded one of history's most dramatic celestial events. In the narrow streets of Cluny, merchants were already setting up their stalls for the morning market. The baker, Guillaume, had been up since before dawn, his ovens crackling with their familiar warmth. But even Guillaume noticed something different. The usual chatter of early customers was subdued, replaced by hushed conversations and nervous glances toward the sky. You have to understand, this was an age where the boundary between the natural and supernatural was gossamer thin. These weren't people who understood the mechanics of celestial orbits or the predictable dance of planetary bodies. To them, the heavens were the domain of God, angels, and occasionally darker forces. Every unusual cloud formation, every strange bird flight pattern, every shift in the wind carried potential meaning. The village children, normally boisterous in their morning play, seemed unusually quiet. They clustered together in small groups, whispering among themselves with the instinctive awareness that children often possess for impending change. Their mothers, busy with morning chores, found themselves glancing upward more frequently than usual, their hands unconsciously making the sign of the cross. As the morning progressed, this collective unease grew more palpable. The dogs, those reliable barometers of atmospheric change, began to pace restlessly. In the fields surrounding Cluny, the livestock exhibited strange behavior. Cows gathered, together in tight clusters lowing softly. Horses nickered nervously, their ears constantly swiveling as if listening for some distant threat. But perhaps most telling of all were the birds. Those of you who've spent time in nature know that birds are often the first to sense atmospheric disturbances. That morning in Cluny, the usual dawn chorus was notably absent. Sparrows huddled together in unusual silence. Even the ever-present crows, normally bold and raucous, seemed to hold their tongues. Inside the abbey, the monks went about their prescribed routines, but Brother Benedict wasn't the only one to notice the strange quality of the day. Brother Thomas, the abbey's astronomer, and one of the few men in the region with any formal understanding of celestial mechanics, had been consulting his charts and calculations with increasing frequency. His training at the cathedral school, Ian Chartres, had exposed him to some of the preserved astronomical works of ancient Greece, filtered through Arabic translations. Thomas knew something that most of his contemporaries did not. This day had been predicted. The calculations, crude by our standards but remarkable for their time, had suggested the possibility of a solar eclipse. But even Thomas, with his scholarly preparation, couldn't have imagined the psychological impact that was about to unfold. As the morning wore on, the quality of light began to shift in ways that defied normal explanation. It wasn't cloudy yet. The sunlight seemed somehow diminished, as if filtered through invisible veils. Shadows appeared sharper, more defined, creating an almost ethereal quality to ordinary objects. The familiar became somehow foreign. In the marketplace, conversations turned increasingly to omens and portents. Old Marie, the herb seller whose weathered face had seen 7 decades of changing seasons, spoke in hushed tones about similar, strange mornings from her youth. She remembered her grandmother's stories about days when the sun lost its strength and what such events might portend. The village priest, Father Anselm, found his morning prayers interrupted by an increasing stream of parishioners seeking reassurance. These weren't the usual petitioners with their familiar troubles of sick children or failing crops. These were people sensing something profound approaching, something beyond their experience or understanding. What makes this historical moment so fascinating is how similar reactions were occurring simultaneously across hundreds of miles. In London, chroniclers would later describe identical atmospheric conditions. In Paris, the same nervous behavior among animals. In Rome, the same quality of strange filtered light. This wasn't localized anxiety. This was a continent-wide phenomenon, building toward its dramatic climax. The abbey's kitchen staff, preparing the midday meal, noticed their usual rhythms disrupted. Conversations that normally flowed easily became stilted and uncertain. Even the simple act of kneading bread seemed to require more concentration than usual. Brother Marcus, the head cook, would later write that it felt as though time itself moved differently that morning. And then, as the sun climbed toward its zenith, the first unmistakable sign appeared. A tiny dark bite seemed to take a nibble from the edge of the sun. It was barely perceptible at first, easily dismissed as a trick of the eye or a passing cloud. But for those few who noticed, who possessed the courage to glance briefly skyward, despite centuries of warnings about looking directly at the sun, that tiny shadow marked the beginning of medieval Europe's confrontation with cosmic forces beyond their comprehension. Brother Thomas, with his astronomical training, was among the first to recognize what was happening. His hands trembled slightly as he consulted his charts one final time, confirming what his calculations had suggested. But even his scholarly preparation couldn't have readied him for what was about to unfold. The morning's strange atmosphere suddenly made perfect sense. The restless animals, the nervous energy, the quality of light, the collective unease, all were nature's subtle preparations for an event that would challenge every assumption about the predictable order of creation. And then, the first shadow touches the sun, and medieval terror awakens. As the shadow begins its relentless march across the sun's blazing surface, terror awakens in the most primal way imaginable. That first nibble of darkness wasn't just astronomical mechanics. It was the moment when the natural order revealed it had been an illusion all along. The eclipse had begun. That first dark bite appearing on the sun's edge was like watching death take its first taste of life itself. Brother Thomas of Canterbury, writing years later, would search for words to capture this moment. The sun appeared wounded, as if pierced by the devil's own blade. But Thomas wasn't crafting poetry. He was a trained chronicler, tasked with recording facts. Yet how do you document the impossible? How do you describe in rational terms the moment when reason itself begins to crumble? Standing there in that square, watching the shadow creep across the solar disk, the temperature would have started dropping almost immediately. You have to understand, in 1185, people didn't have weather forecasts, thermometers, or any scientific framework to explain why the air suddenly felt different. All they knew was that something was terribly, impossibly wrong with the natural order of things. Watch how terror spreads through a crowd like ripples through water. First, the merchants pause their morning haggling, hands frozen over copper, coins. Then the children stop their games, sensing something wrong in the adults' sudden stillness. The village blacksmith drops his hammer, he who fears neither fire nor blade, and makes the sign of the cross with hands that shake like autumn leaves. This wasn't ordinary fear. This was the recognition that everything they'd believed about reality might have been wrong. Medieval cosmology wasn't just astronomy, it was theology written in starlight. Every sunrise was God's daily promise. I am here, I am watching, I will protect you. Every sunset was a gentle reminder, rest now for I will bring the light again. This wasn't metaphor for medieval minds, this was the literal structure of divine covenant. Now that covenant was shattering before their eyes. If God could allow his own light to die, what other promises might prove breakable? What other certainties might dissolve into cosmic darkness? Brother Aldrich, our fictional but absolutely representative monk, would have immediately recognized the signs. He'd spent his entire life studying scripture, and he knew exactly what this meant. The book of Joel spoke of the sun being turned to darkness before the great and terrible day of the Lord. Matthew warned that the sun would be darkened and the moon would not give its light before the Son of Man appeared in heaven. This wasn't just an eclipse. This was prophecy being fulfilled. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Imagine living in a world where your entire understanding of reality is built on the absolute certainty that God controls the heavens, that the sun rises and sets according to his divine will. Then suddenly, without warning, without any sin great enough to justify such punishment, the sun itself begins to die. As the shadow grew larger, consuming more of the solar disk, the crowd's behavior would have shifted dramatically. The murmurs turned to prayers, then the prayers turned to wails of terror. People began falling to their knees, not in reverence, but in absolute desperation. They were witnessing what they believed to be the active dissolution of creation itself. The animals sensed it too. Dogs began howling in that particular way they reserve for death and disaster. Horses stamped and whinnied, their eyes rolling white with fear that had no earthly explanation. Even the birds, those creatures that navigate by the sun's position, began exhibiting the confused behavior typical of dusk, in the middle of what should have been a bright morning. But here's the craziest part. The medieval mind immediately began searching for explanations, for someone to blame. Eclipses didn't just happen randomly in their worldview. They were divine punishment, supernatural warfare, or the result of terrible sins that demanded immediate atonement. Brother Aldrich, watching from his position near the cathedral doors, would have seen the crowd begin to fracture along lines of fear and superstition. Some people immediately began confessing their sins aloud, convinced that their personal transgressions had somehow contributed to this cosmic catastrophe. Others started pointing fingers, looking for scapegoats, for anyone whose wickedness might have brought down God's wrath upon the entire community. The really terrifying thing is that medieval people had historical precedents for this kind of thinking. They knew that eclipses had preceded disasters before. They remembered stories, whether accurate or embellished, of eclipses that had coincided with plagues, famines, the deaths of kings, the fall of kingdoms. In their minds, this wasn't just a celestial event to observe. It was a warning, a sign, a promise of devastation to come. As the shadow continued its inexorable consumption of the sun, the light in the square began to change in ways that would have seemed utterly unnatural to medieval eyes. It wasn't like the gradual dimming of evening, which they understood and expected. This was a harsh metallic light that seemed to drain the color from everything it touched. The very air felt different, thinner, colder, charged with an electric tension that made hair stand on end. Children began crying, not the key, normal fussing of youngsters, but the deep, soul-piercing wails that come from genuine terror. They couldn't understand what was happening, but they could feel the adults' fear like a physical presence in the air. The psychological contagion of mass panic was beginning to take hold, feeding on itself, growing stronger with each passing moment. Brother Aldrich would have recognized his duty in this moment. As a man of God, as someone the community looked to for spiritual guidance and explanation, he needed to provide some kind of framework for understanding this incomprehensible event. But what could he say? How could he explain something that defied every natural law they understood? The truly devastating aspect of this moment is that medieval people were actually quite sophisticated in their understanding of natural phenomena. Within their framework, they could predict weather patterns, understand seasonal changes, navigate by the stars. They weren't ignorant peasants stumbling through life without comprehension. They were intelligent, observant people whose entire system of understanding the world was being systematically destroyed by what they were witnessing. As the eclipse reached its most dramatic phase, with nearly half the sun now consumed by shadow, the crowd's behavior would have become increasingly desperate. Some people began stripping off outer garments and beating themselves, convinced that physical mortification might appease whatever divine anger had caused this catastrophe. Others formed spontaneous prayer circles, chanting Latin phrases they barely understood, but hoped might have protective power. The merchants who had been hawking their wares just minutes before now found themselves with customers who had completely lost interest in earthly goods. What use were new shoes or fresh bread when the world itself might be ending? Money, status, daily concerns, everything that had seemed important at dawn became meaningless in the face of this cosmic horror. Moving from fear to desperate action, the crowd began to organize itself around the only institution that made sense in this moment of absolute crisis: the church. People pressed toward the cathedral doors, not seeking shelter from weather, but sanctuary from what felt like the active wrath of God. They needed to be as close as possible to consecrated ground, to holy relics, to anything that might offer protection from the supernatural forces that were clearly at war in the heavens above. The cathedral bells, which had been ringing the canonical hours just moments before, now took on an entirely different meaning. Their bronze voices became rallying cries, calling the faithful not to worship, but to spiritual battle. Every toll seemed to say, "Come together, pray together, fight this darkness together." The sound carried for miles across the countryside, reaching villages and farms where people stopped their work and looked toward the church towers with a mixture of hope and terror. Inside the cathedral, the scene was equally dramatic. Candles that had flickered peacefully during morning mass now seemed to flicker with desperate urgency. The colored light filtering through stained glass windows took on an eerie quality as the eclipse progressed, casting strange, shifting patterns on the stone floors where hundreds of people knelt in prayer. Father Benedict, the cathedral's senior priest, found himself in the impossible position of trying to provide comfort and explanation for something that challenged the very foundations of medieval cosmology. He stood at the altar, his voice carrying across the vast space filled with frightened believers, trying to find words that could bridge the gap between terror and hope. "My children," his voice echoed through the cathedral, "what we witness in the heavens is a sign of God's power over all creation. We must not despair, but trust in His mercy and His plan for us, even when that plan is beyond our understanding." But even Father Benedict's faith was being tested in ways he had never imagined. As a learned man, he had some knowledge of astronomical events. He understood that eclipses had been predicted by ancient scholars, that they followed patterns that suggested natural rather than purely supernatural causes. Yet standing there in his cathedral, watching his congregation shake with terror as the light failed outside, even his intellectual understanding seemed small and inadequate. The true horror wasn't the darkening sky, it was the crumbling of certainty itself. Imagine building your entire life on one unshakable truth. The sun rises, the sun sets, God keeps His promises. Then imagine watching that truth dissolve in real time. If the sun could die, could God abandon them entirely? If day could become night without warning, what other cosmic laws were merely suggestions? They weren't just losing light, they were losing the foundational logic that made survival possible. Children clung to their mothers' robes, but many mothers found themselves looking around desperately for someone, anyone, who might have answers or comfort to offer. The normal social hierarchies began to blur as fear stripped away the usual polite pretenses. Nobles found themselves kneeling beside peasants, merchants beside beggars, all united in their shared terror and their desperate need for divine protection. The really heartbreaking part is how medieval people tried to apply their existing knowledge systems to something so far beyond their experience. They began reciting every prayer they knew, performing every ritual that had ever brought comfort, following every piece of folk wisdom passed down through generations. Holy water was sprinkled, protective herbs were clutched, religious medals were kissed with desperate fervor, but nothing seemed to work. The shadow continued to grow, the light continued to fail, and the world continued its impossible transformation from day toward a darkness that had no natural explanation in medieval understanding. The eclipse was now more than half complete, and the medieval world stood on the brink of experiencing something that would forever change their understanding of their place in the cosmos. The bells continued to toll, the prayers continued to rise, the protective rituals continued their ancient patterns. But somewhere in the growing darkness, a new understanding was beginning to take shape. Whatever was happening in the sky above was beyond human power to control or comprehend. And as Eclipse reached toward its moment of complete totality, the medieval world stood poised on the edge of an experience that would challenge everything they thought they knew about God, creation, and their place in the cosmic order. But what happened next would reveal something extraordinary about the human spirit that no one, not even the most learned scholars, could have predicted. From anticipation to absolute transformation, and then, in that final heartbeat before the world changed forever, the last sliver of sunlight vanished. What followed wasn't darkness. It was the absence of everything that made sense. Imagine trying to breathe when the air itself seems different. Picture temperatures dropping 10 degrees in moments, as if winter had ambushed summer. Stars appearing in broad daylight, scattered across a purple-black sky, like scattered diamonds on velvet. The horizon glowing with impossible fire in all directions simultaneously. This wasn't night. Night was predictable, gentle, full of familiar sounds and comforting routines. This was cosmic abandonment, the moment when the fundamental laws of existence simply stopped working. Here's where medieval experience becomes almost impossible to imagine from our modern perspective. The air itself turned metallic, tasting of copper and fear. Your breath became visible in what had been warm summer air moments before. The family dog, who'd been lazily sleeping in the courtyard, began howling with a sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. And there, hanging in the purple-black sky where the sun should have been, was something no medieval eye had ever seen, the sun's ghostly corona, looking like nothing less than the spectre of the murdered light. And there, where the sun should have been, hung something that medieval eyes had never seen before, the sun's corona, that ethereal crown of light that only becomes visible during total eclipse. To us it might seem beautiful, even spiritual, but to medieval observers it looked like nothing less than the ghost of the dead sun, a spectral reminder of the light that had been murdered in the heavens. The silence was almost as terrifying as the darkness. Birds, confused by the sudden nightfall, returned to their roosts with anxious chirping. Roosters began to crow, thinking evening had arrived. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, creating an unnatural stillness that made every small sound, a crying child, a whispered prayer, the shuffle of feet on stone, seem unnaturally loud and significant. But it was the human response that reveals the most about medieval understanding of the cosmos. Brother Aldrich, standing in the cathedral square, watched as his entire community confronted what they believed to be the end of the world. Some people fell completely silent, struck dumb by the impossibility of what they were witnessing. Others began wailing with a grief so deep it seemed to come from the very foundations of their souls. What strikes me as absolutely fascinating is how different individuals process this moment of ultimate terror. The scholars, like Brother Thomas, found their intellectual frameworks completely inadequate. all their charts and calculations, all their understanding of celestial mechanics meant nothing when confronted with the raw psychological impact of watching the sun die. Knowledge couldn't protect them from the primal fear that comes when the most basic constants of existence suddenly prove unreliable. The common people, those who had never pretended to understand the heavens, sometimes showed remarkable resilience. I'm thinking of people like Agnes, the baker's wife, who might have whispered to her terrified children, "The sun has gone to sleep, but it will wake up again. God wouldn't abandon us forever." Their lack of sophisticated astronomical understanding sometimes worked in their favor, allowing them to hold on to simpler, more comforting explanations. The religious response was perhaps the most complex. Father Benedict and the other clergy found themselves in the impossible position of needing to provide spiritual leadership during what seemed like the literal apocalypse. Some rose to the challenge magnificently, their voices carrying clearly through the darkness as they led prayers and offered reassurance. Others found their own faith shaken to its foundations, struggling to reconcile their belief in a benevolent God with this cosmic horror unfolding above them. Children reacted with that mysterious wisdom that sometimes emerges in moments of crisis. While adults struggled to fit this event into their existing frameworks of understanding, children often simply accepted that something extraordinary was happening. They clung to their parents, certainly, but many seemed less terrified than the adults around them. Perhaps their minds, not yet completely shaped by adult assumptions about how the world should work, were more adaptable to witnessing the impossible. The eclipse lasted only a few minutes. Historical records suggest totality lasted between 2 and 4 minutes in most locations, but those minutes stretched like hours in the medieval imagination. Time itself seemed suspended, as if the normal progression of moments had stopped along with the sun's light. People would later swear that the eclipse lasted much longer than it actually did, their terror stretching those precious minutes into what felt like an eternity of cosmic abandonment. And then, as suddenly as it had vanished, the sun's light began to return. The first tiny sliver of brilliant light pierced the darkness, and with it came the most overwhelming flood of relief and gratitude medieval Europe had ever experienced. People who had been convinced they were witnessing the end of the world suddenly found themselves reprieved, given another chance at life they hadn't dared hope for. The psychological transformation was immediate and profound. Tears of terror became tears of joy. Wails of despair transformed into shouts of thanksgiving. People who had been preparing for death found themselves celebrating resurrection, not just of the sun, but of hope itself. Brother Aldrich, his voice hoarse from prayer and emotion, raised his hands toward the returning light and spoke words that would be remembered for generations. "Behold, God's mercy is greater than his wrath. The sun lives, and so do we." His words captured something essential about the medieval experience of eclipse. It wasn't just an astronomical event, but a profound spiritual trial that tested faith and emerged stronger. But the impact of those few minutes of totality would echo through medieval communities for decades to come. People had been forced to confront the possibility that the fundamental assumptions of their existence might be wrong. They had stared into cosmic darkness and found resources of courage and faith they didn't know they possessed. They had experienced terror so profound it changed their understanding of what was possible in God's creation. In this darkest moment, humanity's response would reveal not just our capacity for terror, but our extraordinary ability to find light, even when the sun itself abandons us. From cosmic terror to human resilience, this eclipse wasn't just a cosmic phenomenon witnessed by astronomers and scholars. As the last light faded and totality embraced the medieval world, ordinary people, farmers, nobles, children, and clergy, found themselves face to face with something their minds could barely comprehend. The stories of how individuals responded in those precious moments of darkness reveal the most human side of this extraordinary event. The stories of how individuals responded in those precious moments of darkness reveal the most human side of this extraordinary event. Let me paint this picture for you. In a small village outside Canterbury, Thomas the farmer had been working his fields when the eclipse began. This was a man whose entire life revolved around the sun, when to plant, when to harvest, when to rest. His existence was built on the absolute reliability of daylight. Now standing in his partially reaped wheat field, under an impossibly dark sky dotted with midday stars, Thomas faced a crisis that went far beyond anything his rural experience had prepared him for. But here's what absolutely fascinates me about the human response to this event. According to the account left by a traveling monk who recorded the story years later, Thomas gathered his wife and children into their small cottage, lit every candle they possessed, and began telling them stories. Not religious stories, not explanations about eclipses, but simple tales about other times, when things had seemed impossible but worked out in the end. He created light and comfort with the tools he had, fire and words and love. Meanwhile, in the royal court, a completely different drama was unfolding. Queen Isabella, one of the most powerful women in medieval England, found herself in the palace gardens when the eclipse reached totality. Her chroniclers noted that she initially reacted with the same terror as any commoner, falling to her knees, calling for her confessor. But then something remarkable happened. As the darkness deepened and her courtiers began to panic, Isabella stood up and began organizing a response. She ordered every servant to light torches and candles throughout the palace. She commanded her musicians to play, not religious music, but cheerful melodies that might lift spirits. She instructed her kitchen staff to prepare a feast for when the light returned, because she declared with royal certainty, God would not abandon us forever, and we will celebrate when his light returns to us. Isabella turned her terror into action, and her action helped an entire household survive the darkest moments of the eclipse with dignity intact. The story gets even more interesting when we look at monastic communities. At Westminster Abbey, Brother William was copying manuscripts in the scriptorium when totality struck. The sudden darkness was so complete that he couldn't see the ink on his pen. But instead of fleeing, he stayed at his writing desk and began to pray aloud, not in Latin, which his fellow monks would have expected, but in English, so that the lay workers in the scriptorium could understand and join in. His simple prayer became a rallying point for everyone in that room. Lord, he said, we cannot see to work, but we can see to love each other. We cannot light the sun, but we can light our own hearts. By the time the eclipse ended, that room full of terrified people had become a community, bound together by shared experience of divine mystery. Children's responses were often the most remarkable of all. At a village school near Winchester, young Margaret, only 8 years old, surprised her teacher during totality by asking not, "When will the light come back?" but, "What can we learn from this darkness?" When her teacher, Sister Catherine, asked what she meant, Margaret replied, "If God can make the sun go dark, imagine what else he can do that we don't know about yet." Out of the mouths of babes, right? This child had somehow transformed cosmic terror into cosmic wonder, finding in the eclipse not an ending but a beginning, the beginning of questions that would drive human curiosity for centuries to come. The nobility handled the crisis in ways that reflected their unique position in medieval society. Lord Edmund of Sussex was hosting a hunting party when the eclipse reached totality. Instead of cancelling the hunt or hiding in the castle, he transformed the event into something unprecedented, a night hunt in the middle of the day. He ordered torches lit and led his guests through the darkened forest, turning terror into adventure. His guests later said it was the most extraordinary experience of their lives, hunting by torchlight under a star-filled sky while the sun's corona glowed overhead like some celestial beacon. Edmund had intuitively understood something profound. When faced with the impossible, sometimes the best response is to embrace it fully rather than simply endure it. Edmund had intuitively understood something profound. When faced with the impossible, sometimes the best response is to embrace it fully rather than simply endure it. But perhaps the most moving individual story comes from a hospice run by the Sisters of Mercy outside London. Sister Mary Magdalene was caring for a dying man named Robert when the eclipse began. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped, Robert became frightened, thinking his death was approaching. But Sister Mary did something beautiful. She gathered all the other patients who were able to move and brought them to Robert's bedside. If we're going to witness the end of the world, she told them, let's witness it together with love. The hospice patients spent those minutes of totality holding hands, sharing stories of their lives, offering comfort to each other. When the light returned, Robert was still dying, but he was no longer afraid. He died 2 days later, and his last words were reportedly, "I have seen the sun die and be reborn. Death holds no terror for me now." These individual stories reveal something extraordinary about the human spirit during crisis. People didn't just passively endure the eclipse, they transformed it into something meaningful through their responses. They created light in darkness, found community in isolation, discovered courage in terror. What strikes me most is how these medieval individuals, lacking any scientific understanding of what was happening, nevertheless found ways to respond with dignity, creativity, and love. They couldn't explain the eclipse, but they could choose how to face it. And in making those choices, they revealed something timeless about human resilience. The farmer told stories by candlelight. The queen organized a celebration. The monk prayed in the vernacular. The child asked questions. The nobleman created adventure. The nun fostered community. Each response was different, but all shared a common thread: the refusal to let cosmic terror have the final word in human experience. As totality passed, first light returns, and these individuals found themselves changed not just by what they had witnessed, but by how they had chosen to witness it. They had discovered resources within themselves they didn't know existed. They had learned that even when the sun itself fails, the human capacity for light, for love, courage, creativity, and hope remains undimmed. Moving from darkness back toward light, we see how this cosmic event didn't just change the sky above medieval England. It changed the hearts and minds of everyone who witnessed it, leaving echoes that would resonate through their communities for generations to come. And then, like a blessed miracle unfolding across the heavens, the first sliver of golden light pierced through the darkness. I can hardly imagine the overwhelming relief that must have washed over every soul who witnessed that moment. After what felt like an eternity of cosmic terror, the sun's radiant edge emerged from behind the moon's shadow, and with it came the most profound sense of deliverance medieval Europe had ever experienced. Picture this scene with me. The impossible. Darkness that had fallen over the land began to lift, not gradually like dawn, but in a sudden rush of returning light that seemed to breathe life back into the world itself. The strange purple twilight of totality gave way to that familiar golden warmth that had been so cruelly absent. People who had been convinced they were witnessing the end of everything suddenly found themselves reprieved, granted another chance at life they hadn't dared hope for. The psychological transformation was instantaneous and overwhelming. In cathedral squares across England, wails of terror transformed into cries of jubilation. People who had fallen to their knees in despair now struggled to their feet, arms raised toward the returning sun in gestures of pure gratitude. The medieval world was experiencing its own resurrection, and the emotional impact was beyond anything they could have imagined. Brother Benedict, our chronicler at Cluny Abbey, would later write that the moment light returned felt like God's own hand lifting the veil of death from creation. But what strikes me as most remarkable isn't just the relief, it's how quickly that relief transformed into something deeper. This wasn't just happiness that the crisis had passed. This was a profound spiritual awakening that would reshape medieval understanding for generations. Children who had been crying in terror began laughing with pure, uninhibited joy. Adults who had spent those dark minutes certain they were about to die found themselves embracing strangers, sharing tears of relief with people they had never spoken to before. The eclipse had stripped away social conventions and created a community bound together by shared survival of what they believed had been the impossible. The bells that had been tolling in alarm throughout the eclipse now began ringing in celebration. Every church tower across the English countryside added its bronze, voiced to a symphony of gratitude that carried for miles. The sound was unlike anything medieval ears had heard before. Not the measured tolling of canonical hours or the solemnity of funeral rites, but pure, joyous noise that celebrated nothing more complex than the fact that the sun still existed. But here's what makes this moment absolutely fascinating from a historical perspective. The medieval response to the returning light revealed something profound about their worldview. They didn't just see this as the end of a natural phenomenon, they saw it as divine mercy made manifest. They didn't just see this as the end of a natural phenomenon, they saw it as divine mercy made manifest. God had tested them with cosmic terror and found them worthy of redemption. The sun's return wasn't just astronomical mechanics, it was proof of divine love. Father Benedict, standing before his cathedral congregation, found words that captured the moment perfectly. My children, we have witnessed God's power over all creation, and we have witnessed His mercy. The darkness came, as darkness must, but the light returned, as light always does for those who keep faith. His words became a template for understanding eclipse experience throughout medieval Europe. The immediate aftermath was extraordinary. People emerged from churches and homes into a world that looked exactly the same as it had hours before, but felt completely transformed. The same cobblestone streets, the same thatched roofs, the same familiar faces, but everything was touched by the glow of survival, of having endured the impossible and lived to tell about it. Markets that had been abandoned in terror suddenly filled with people who needed to share their experiences, to tell and retell what they had witnessed. But these weren't just stories of fear. They were tales of discovery. People had learned things about themselves during those minutes of darkness that they never could have imagined. They had found courage they didn't know they possessed, faith they didn't know they could maintain, love they didn't know they could express. The village. Blacksmith, who had fled to the church, found himself describing how in the darkest moment he had held a stranger's child to comfort her fears. The merchant, who had worried only about his goods, discovered he had spent the eclipse praying for his competitors' families. The noble lady, who had never spoken to a peasant, found herself recounting how she had shared her cloak with a beggar. In the cathedral square, Eclipse had revealed something extraordinary about human nature, that in moments of ultimate crisis, people often discover their best selves rather than their worst. The medieval world had faced what they believed was cosmic judgment and had responded not with violence or selfishness, but with community and compassion. Brother Thomas, the astronomer whose calculations had predicted this event, found himself in a curious position. His scholarly understanding was vindicated. The eclipse had occurred exactly when and how he had calculated. But his intellectual triumph felt small compared to the spiritual transformation he witnessed around him. Knowledge, he realized, was valuable, but it was nothing compared to the human capacity for faith and love in the face of the unknown. The returning light also brought practical concerns back into focus, but with a changed perspective. Farmers returned to their fields, but many would later say that their work felt different afterward, less like struggle and more like cooperation with divine purpose. Merchants reopened their stalls, but transactions were marked by unusual kindness and patience. Children returned to their games, but their play often incorporated new elements, games about darkness and light, about hiding and being found, about endings that became beginnings. Medieval chroniclers noted that the months following the eclipse were marked by unusual harmony in communities across Europe. Disputes that had seemed important before the eclipse were resolved more easily. Families that had been estranged found ways to reconcile. Even conflicts between neighboring villages often settled into peace, as if the shared experience of cosmic terror had reminded everyone what truly mattered. The religious impact was profound and lasting. Churches reported increased attendance, but more importantly, they noted a change in the quality of worship. People weren't just going through the motions of religious observance, they were participating with a depth of feeling that came from having confronted the possibility of divine abandonment and discovered divine mercy instead. Artists and craftsmen began incorporating eclipse imagery into their work, not the terrifying dragons of traditional eclipse mythology, but symbols of transformation and renewal. Stained glass windows began featuring scenes of darkness giving way to light. Illuminated manuscripts showed the sun crowned with the ethereal beauty of the corona, transformed from symbol of constant reliability into symbol of divine mystery and power. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on medieval understanding of change itself. Before the eclipse, change was often seen as threatening, a disruption of divine order. After witnessing the sun itself transform and return, change began to be understood differently, as part of divine plan, as opportunity for renewal, as proof that even the most fundamental constants could be transformed without being destroyed. The eclipse had ended, but its influences were just beginning. Communities across medieval Europe found themselves changed in ways both subtle and profound. They had survived the impossible, and in surviving, they had discovered capacities for resilience, faith, and love that would reshape their culture for generations to come. But eclipses left lasting marks on medieval society that went far beyond the immediate emotional impact of surviving cosmic terror. What I'm about to share with you next reveals something remarkable about human nature that most historians completely miss. Let's explore how this celestial event changed communities in ways that would echo through generations. But the eclipse's influence didn't end when the last shadow lifted from the earth. Imagine this: entire communities restructuring their lives around 4 minutes of cosmic terror. Farmers who had lived by sunrise and sunset for generations, suddenly developing new rituals for when the sky might lie again. Children born after the eclipse growing up with lullabies that included verses about the day the sun went dark, but came back because we were brave. This wasn't just trauma, it was transformation. I'm fascinated by how profoundly this single event transformed medieval culture in ways that would persist for centuries. The eclipse didn't just scare people and then fade into memory. It became a reference point that redefined how communities understood time, fear, preparation, and even their relationship with the divine. Let's start with something as basic as daily routines. Before the eclipse, medieval people had lived their lives according to predictable patterns: sunrise, sunset, the canonical hours marked by church bells, seasonal cycles that had governed agriculture for generations. The eclipse shattered this sense of predictability in the most fundamental way possible. If the sun itself could disappear without warning, what else might prove unreliable? The response was fascinating. Communities across England began developing what we might call shadow protocols, new customs and practices designed to prepare for cosmic emergencies. The Abbey at Canterbury, for example, instituted what they called umbral vigils, special prayers performed whenever unusual shadows or strange light appeared in the sky. These weren't just religious observances, they were psychological preparation for the possibility that the impossible might happen again. Brother Marcus, the chronicler at York Minster, described how his community began keeping crisis candles, special blessed candles that were never lit except during emergencies that defied natural explanation. These candles became precious community resources, maintained by the church but available to all. The practice spread throughout northern England, creating a network of communities prepared for supernatural crisis. But here's where it gets really interesting. The eclipse also changed medieval understanding of community solidarity. During those moments of totality, social hierarchies had temporarily dissolved. Nobles and peasants had knelt together in terror, shared candles and comfort, without regard to class distinction. This experience of radical equality in the face of cosmic crisis created lasting changes in social relationships. Villages began instituting what they called shadow days, annual commemorations of the eclipse that deliberately reversed normal social order. On these days, the poorest villagers would be served first at community meals, nobles would perform manual labor, and everyone would participate in activities that emphasized shared humanity over social distinction. It was as if communities were trying to preserve the profound sense of equality they had experienced during the eclipse. The economic impacts were equally surprising. You might expect that an event as terrifying as a total eclipse would make medieval people more conservative, more focused on hoarding resources against future disasters. But the opposite happened in many communities. Having survived what they believed was the possible end of the world, people developed a different relationship with material possessions. The village of Glastonbury, for instance, began practicing eclipse generosity, a custom where families would annually give away their most precious possession to someone in greater need, commemorating their gratitude for surviving cosmic terror. The practice spread throughout the West Country, creating networks of mutual aid that strengthened community bonds for generations. Medieval craft guilds began incorporating eclipse symbolism into their work in ways that revealed deeper changes in consciousness. The stonemasons' guild at Winchester started carving small eclipse symbols into every cathedral they built. Not just decorative elements, but what they called remembrance marks that would remind future generations that even the most solid, permanent structures existed in a world where the impossible could happen. Blacksmiths began forging eclipse iron, horseshoes and tools made with specific prayers and techniques developed after the eclipse. These weren't just functional objects, they were talismans that combined practical utility with spiritual protection. The tradition spread throughout medieval Europe, creating a craft tradition that lasted for centuries. But the most profound changes occurred in medieval education and child rearing. Parents who had witnessed their children's terror during the eclipse began teaching differently about fear and courage. Instead of protecting children from knowledge of cosmic dangers, they began preparing them psychologically for the possibility of experiencing the impossible. The cathedral school at Salisbury developed what they called wonder education, a curriculum that deliberately exposed students to accounts of miraculous events, eclipses, and other phenomena that challenged normal understanding. The goal wasn't to frighten children, but to develop their capacity for maintaining faith and reason simultaneously when confronted with the impossible. Children who had experienced the eclipse grew up with a fundamentally different understanding of change and stability than their parents. They had learned young that even the most basic constants, like the sun shining during the day, could be disrupted. This made them more adaptable, more psychologically flexible, and arguably more prepared for the rapid changes that would characterize the later medieval period. The eclipse also transformed medieval approaches to record-keeping and historical consciousness. Before 1185, most communities kept only basic records: births, deaths, major political events. After the eclipse, detailed chronicle keeping became common throughout England. People had experienced something they desperately wanted future generations to understand and remember. These eclipse chronicles weren't just factual accounts, they were careful records of human response to the impossible. They documented not just what happened in the sky, but what happened in hearts and communities. Brother Thomas of Winchester wrote, "Let our children's children know not just that the sun failed, but that we did not fail when the sun failed." Agricultural practices changed in surprising ways. Farmers began developing what they called shadow crops, emergency food supplies specifically maintained for cosmic crises. But these weren't just practical preparations. They represented a fundamental shift in medieval understanding of human relationship to natural cycles. Having seen the sun itself disrupted, farming communities developed more complex, resilient, agricultural systems that could survive supernatural as well as natural disasters. The eclipse even influenced medieval architecture. Churches built after 1185 often incorporated eclipse windows, special openings designed to create interesting light effects during unusual atmospheric conditions. These architectural features served both practical and spiritual purposes, providing beautiful light during normal times, while creating sacred spaces specifically designed for times when normal light failed. Medieval medicine developed new approaches to treating what we might now call post-traumatic stress. Physicians and monks observed that many people who experienced the eclipse suffered from persistent anxiety, sleep disturbances, and difficulty concentrating. They developed treatment approaches that combined herbal remedies with what they called light therapy, carefully designed exposures to candle flame and sunlight intended to restore psychological balance. These medical innovations revealed something remarkable about medieval psychological sophistication. They understood that experiencing cosmic terror left lasting marks on the human spirit that required intentional healing. Their treatments, while different from modern approaches, showed genuine insight into the connection between extraordinary experience and long-term mental health. The legal system even adapted to eclipse experience. Courts began recognizing cosmic juris as a legitimate explanation for unusual behavior during supernatural events. People who had acted out of character during the eclipse, abandoning responsibilities, making unusual promises, or behaving in ways that violated social norms, could appeal to eclipse experience as mitigating circumstances. This legal innovation reflected deeper changes in medieval understanding of individual responsibility and social expectation. Having witnessed an entire community respond to impossible circumstances, medieval people developed more nuanced appreciation for the complexity of human behavior under extreme stress. These changes reveal medieval resilience in the most fundamental way possible, not just the ability to survive crisis, but the capacity to transform crisis into community strength. And so we see how communities adapted, showing us that the eclipse wasn't just an astronomical event that passed through medieval Europe. It was a catalyst that permanently altered how an entire civilization understood its relationship with the cosmos, creating legacies that would echo through the centuries in ways both profound and utterly unexpected. This adaptation wasn't just about surviving one terrible winter or understanding one cosmic event. This adaptation wasn't just about surviving one terrible winter or understanding one cosmic event. What emerged from the ashes of medieval fear was something far more profound, an entire cultural transformation that would reshape how humanity approached the unknown for centuries to come. The generation that witnessed the 1185 eclipse became carriers of a fundamentally different worldview than their parents had possessed. They had learned through direct experience that the impossible could happen, that the most basic constants of existence could be disrupted, and that human communities could survive such disruptions through mutual support and adaptive resilience. These eclipse survivors became teachers, parents, leaders, and chroniclers who passed on more than just stories of a dark day. They transmitted hard-won wisdom about facing the unknown with courage, about finding light in darkness, about discovering strength in community when individual understanding failed. The scholarly legacy was equally remarkable. Medieval universities began developing what we might recognize as early scientific method, not the systematic empiricism that would emerge centuries later, but approaches to understanding natural phenomena that balanced observation, logic, and spiritual insight. The eclipse had demonstrated that both scholarly knowledge and popular wisdom had important contributions to make to human understanding. Brother Albert of Cologne, writing 50 years after the eclipse, captured this integration beautifully. We have learned that God speaks through both revelation and through the movements of the heavens, and that human reason and divine faith are not enemies but partners in comprehending the mysteries of creation. This intellectual synthesis would prove crucial to the development of medieval scholasticism and eventually to the scientific revolution. The eclipse generation had learned to hold multiple ways of knowing in productive tension rather than choosing between them. The artistic legacy extended far beyond eclipse imagery. Medieval artists began exploring themes of transformation, renewal, and the beauty that could emerge from terror. The magnificent rose windows that began appearing in Gothic cathedrals during this period reflected not just architectural innovation, but a new appreciation for the interplay between light and darkness. Illuminated manuscripts from the decades following the eclipse show subtle but significant changes in how medieval artists depicted the relationship between human and divine. Where earlier art often showed humans as passive recipients of divine action, post-eclipse art increasingly depicted humans as active participants in cosmic drama, not just witnesses to divine power, but collaborators in divine purpose. The musical traditions that emerged from eclipse communities reflected this same shift. Gregorian chant began incorporating more complex harmonies that musically represented the interplay between light and darkness, certainty and mystery. Secular music developed new forms that celebrated human resilience and community solidarity in the face of supernatural crisis. Medieval literature was perhaps most profoundly transformed. The great romance cycles that would define high medieval culture, stories of knights facing impossible quests, lovers overcoming supernatural obstacles, communities surviving magical crises, all bore the deep influence of eclipse experience. These weren't just entertaining stories, they were cultural templates for understanding how humans could face the impossible with dignity and courage. The eclipse had taught medieval people that their world contained more mystery and possibility than they had imagined. Literature became a way of exploring that expanded sense of what might be possible, both terrible and wonderful, in a universe where even the sun could die and be reborn. Perhaps most importantly, the eclipse established patterns of community response to crisis that would serve medieval Europe through the challenges of the later Middle Ages. The Black Death, the 100 Years' War, the social upheavals of the 14th century. All would be met by communities that had learned from their eclipse ancestors how to maintain human dignity and mutual support when confronted with the seemingly impossible. The eclipse survivors had discovered something profound about human nature, that people are at their best not when life is easy and predictable, but when they face the unknown together with courage and love. This discovery became part of medieval DNA, shaping how communities would respond to crisis for generations. As we near our journey's end, we can see how a single day of cosmic terror became the foundation for centuries of human resilience, creativity, and hope. Let's reflect on these medieval experiences and what they reveal about the timeless capacity of human communities to transform crisis into opportunity, darkness into light, terror into wisdom. The eclipse of 1185 was ending, but its deepest lessons were just beginning to unfold. As communities across medieval Europe settled into the comfortable certainty of returned sunlight, something profound had shifted in the collective human spirit. They had witnessed the impossible and survived it. They had faced cosmic terror and discovered that terror was not the final word in human experience. What strikes me most about these medieval eclipse experiences is how they reveal something timeless about human nature that transcends any particular historical period. When confronted with the incomprehensible, medieval people didn't just endure passively. They created meaning, they built community, they transformed terror into wisdom and darkness into deeper appreciation for light. They built community. They transformed terror into wisdom and darkness into deeper appreciation for light. Picture Brother Thomas, our learned astronomer, sitting in his monastery cell weeks after the eclipse, writing in his journal by candlelight. He had predicted the event intellectually, but experiencing it had taught him something no calculation could have conveyed. Knowledge, he wrote, is useful for understanding what happens. Wisdom is necessary for understanding what it means that it happens. This distinction between knowledge and wisdom became one of the eclipse's most important legacies. Medieval scholars began to understand that human beings needed both intellectual frameworks and emotional resources to navigate a world where the impossible could become reality without warning. The eclipse had also revealed something beautiful about human community. In those moments of absolute darkness, social distinctions had dissolved not through conflict or revolution, but through shared recognition of fundamental human equality before cosmic mystery. Noble and peasant, scholar and farmer, adult and child, all had faced the same terror and discovered the same capacity for courage, love, and mutual support. Agnes, the baker's wife, now months after the eclipse, found herself changed in ways both subtle and profound. She still rose before dawn to knead bread, still worried about feeding her family, still faced the daily challenges of medieval life. But she carried within her the memory of holding a stranger's child during those dark minutes, of feeling her own fear transformed into compassion by the greater need around her. This transformation of fear into compassion became perhaps the eclipse's most lasting gift to medieval culture. Communities had learned that their first response to crisis need not be self-preservation, but care for others. They had discovered that humans are often most human, not when life is comfortable, but when life demands the best of their courage and love. Children who had experienced the eclipse grew up with a different relationship to change and uncertainty than their parents had possessed. Young Margaret, who had asked what they could learn from darkness, became a teacher who helped her own students understand that the unknown was not necessarily threatening. It was simply unknown, full of possibilities both wonderful and terrible. These eclipse children, as they came to be known, developed remarkable psychological resilience. They had learned young that the world contained more mystery than anyone could fully comprehend, but that mystery was not their enemy. It was the space where faith and reason could work together, where human communities could discover capabilities they never knew they possessed. Time itself had revealed its secret during those impossible minutes. Those 4 minutes of totality had contained lifetimes. Agnes, the baker's wife, swore the eclipse lasted half the morning, while Brother Thomas, watching his hourglass, insisted it was barely longer than a prayer. Both were telling the truth. They had discovered that meaningful time and measured time were entirely different creatures. This revelation rippled through medieval consciousness. If brief moments could hold eternity, what might eternity hold that they'd never imagined? Medieval people began to understand that significant time was not just chronological time, the regular progression of minutes and hours, but kairos time, moments when the ordinary world opened into extraordinary meaning. The eclipse had been such a moment, and recognizing its significance helped them identify and appreciate similar moments in their everyday lives. Brother Benedict, our chronicler at Cluny, captured this beautifully in his final eclipse entry. We learned that God's time and man's time are not the same. In God's time, minutes can contain miracles, seconds can hold salvation, and brief darkness can illuminate truths that years of sunlight had left hidden. This understanding of meaningful time became central to medieval spirituality and philosophy. It influenced the development of contemplative practices that helped people recognize sacred moments within ordinary experience. It shaped artistic techniques that could capture eternal meaning within temporal forms. The agricultural communities that had faced the eclipse developed what they called seasonal wisdom, a deeper understanding of natural cycles that incorporated both predictable patterns and the possibility of supernatural disruption. They learned to plan for normal seasons while maintaining flexibility for abnormal ones, creating more resilient farming systems that could adapt to unexpected changes. This agricultural wisdom became a metaphor for human life generally. Just as farmers learned to expect normal seasons while preparing for unusual ones, individuals learned to build their lives around predictable patterns while maintaining inner resources for unpredictable challenges. The eclipse had revealed that resilience was not just individual, but communal. People survived cosmic terror not through personal strength alone, but through networks of mutual support that transcended ordinary social boundaries. This communal resilience became a defining characteristic of medieval culture, expressed through guild systems, religious communities, and the elaborate social structures that helped individuals navigate both normal life and extraordinary crises. Medieval people began to understand that human beings were fundamentally social creatures, whose greatest strength lay not in individual achievement, but in their capacity to create communities that could respond to any challenge with courage, creativity, and love. As twilight settles gently over our medieval journey, we can see how a single astronomical event became the foundation for profound cultural transformation. The eclipse had taught medieval people that their world was larger, stranger, and more wonderful than they had imagined. It had revealed human communities capable of extraordinary resilience and grace under pressure. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that darkness, however profound, was not permanent. Light always returned, not because humans could control it, but because the universe itself was structured around the eternal return of hope. And as we conclude our medieval journey into the heart of eclipse terror and community resilience, let's rest in the comfort of historical understanding and the timeless human capacity to transform crisis into wisdom, fear into love, and darkness into deeper appreciation for the light that always eventually returns to warm our world and illuminate our path forward. Finally, let's rest in the comfort of historical understanding as we close this gentle exploration of medieval courage. In the face of cosmic mystery, our journey through the eclipse of 1185 draws to its natural close, like the soft settling of twilight after a long and eventful day. We have walked alongside Brother Thomas as he consulted his ancient manuscripts by candlelight, felt the terror of villagers watching their sun disappear, witnessed the extraordinary courage of ordinary people facing the impossible with dignity and grace. We have seen how medieval communities transformed cosmic terror into lasting wisdom, how they discovered that their greatest strength lay not in individual knowledge, but in their capacity to care for each other when understanding failed, and only love remained reliable. The eclipse taught these medieval souls something we might still learn from them today, that the unknown need not be feared if we face it together, that darkness, however profound, is not the final truth about existence, that human beings possess remarkable resources of courage, creativity, and compassion that emerge most clearly when life demands the very best of our humanity. Brother Thomas, writing his final observations months after the eclipse, captured something beautiful about this transformation. We feared the darkness would reveal our weakness. Instead, it revealed our strength. We thought the failing sun would show us how little we could control. Instead, it showed us how much we could love. Those medieval villagers who held strangers' children during the darkest moments, who shared their candles and their courage, who transformed terror into community, they left us a legacy more valuable than any treasure. They showed us that humans are at their most human, not when life is comfortable and predictable, but when life calls forth the deepest resources of heart and spirit. Agnes, the baker's wife, returning to her daily bread-making but forever changed by those moments of holding another's child in darkness. Young Margaret, growing into a teacher who helped students understand that questions could be more valuable than answers. Lord Edmund, discovering that adventure could be found even in terror if approached with the right spirit. Each of these individuals carried forward the eclipse's most important lesson. That meaning comes not from avoiding crisis, but from how we choose to meet it. That resilience grows not from pretending the world is safe and predictable, but from developing the inner resources to face unpredictability with grace. The eclipse survivors became the teachers of their generation, passing on hard-won wisdom about finding light in darkness, about discovering strength in community, about maintaining hope when hope seems unreasonable. They learned that the human spirit, like the sun itself, might disappear temporarily but possesses an extraordinary capacity for renewal and return. Medieval people understood something we sometimes forget, that we are not separate individuals struggling alone through an uncertain world, but members of communities that can support each other through any challenge if we remember to reach across the boundaries that usually divide us. Their eclipse experience became a template for facing all the other eclipses that life brings. The personal darknesses of loss and grief, the communal shadows of conflict and disaster, the cultural challenges that test our collective wisdom and resolve. As we settle into the quiet comfort of historical perspective, we carry forward their most precious gift, the knowledge that darkness reveals light's true value. Those medieval souls who held strangers' children during cosmic terror, who shared their last candles with neighbors they'd barely known, who discovered that love grows strongest in the spaces where understanding fails, they left us a map for navigating our own impossible moments. In our age of uncertainty, their eclipse wisdom whispers across 8 centuries. The unknown is not your enemy, isolation is not your destiny, and the darkest moments often birth the brightest discoveries about what humans can become when they choose to become it together. The eclipse of 1185 ended over 8 centuries ago, but its lessons continue to illuminate our path forward. Those medieval communities showed us that human beings are capable of extraordinary grace under pressure, remarkable resilience in the face of crisis, and beautiful creativity in transforming terror into wisdom. We've journeyed together through that terrifying August morning, felt the fear of villagers watching their sun disappear, witnessed the courage of ordinary people facing the impossible. We've discovered how Brother Thomas's calculations meant little compared to the human response, how Agnes, the baker's wife, found strength in caring for others, how entire communities transformed cosmic terror into lasting wisdom about facing the unknown together. Through our exploration of medieval eclipse experience, you've gained something precious, an understanding of how humans have always found light in darkness, how communities survive the impossible through mutual support, and how the most terrifying moments often reveal our greatest capacities for courage and love. Brother Thomas, closing his final eclipse chronicle, offered words that speak across the centuries to our own time. What we witnessed in the sky was wonderful and terrible. What we discovered in ourselves was simply wonderful. May those who come after us remember both truths, that the world contains mysteries beyond our understanding, and that we contain capacities beyond our imagining. As sleep settles gently over our exploration of medieval courage and cosmic wonder, we carry forward their gift, the knowledge that darkness is temporary, that community is powerful, and that the human capacity for light is as reliable as the sun itself. If this gentle journey through history's mysteries has brought you the peace and perspective you sought, you might find comfort in exploring more of these cozy historical moments together. There are countless other stories waiting, in the gentle corners of the past, each one offering its own quiet wisdom for those seeking rest through learning. Thank you for joining me in this cozy corner of history, for allowing these medieval voices to speak across time about the timeless truths of human resilience, community courage, and the eternal return of hope. May their wisdom bring you comfort, their example inspire your courage, and their faith in the return of light illuminate your own journey through whatever eclipses await. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers, through the gentle mysteries of history. Rest well, knowing that like our medieval ancestors, you too possess the strength to face whatever impossible things tomorrow might bring, armed with the same resources they discovered: love, courage, community, and the patient certainty that morning always comes. Sleep peacefully in the comfort of historical understanding and the timeless human capacity to transform any darkness into deeper appreciation for the light.